Good morning, Zoe. Thank you for joining Procurement League. We are really excited for our conversation today. I have seen you speak on multiple occasions at global forums, and I'm really impressed with your expertise and passion in this area of game theory and online negotiations. So I thought it is fitting to have you as our guest on Procurement League. So welcome on board.
Thank you so much for having me. As you have probably been able to tell, I'm very passionate about this topic, so I'm really excited to talk about it today.
We like that. We like that. We like the people who bring the passion to this, so-called not so well followed or sexy practice procurement, then in that sense, right? So we are always looking forward to people like that.
But
So
this
Joe,
topic makes it sexier, so there you go.
oh my God, that's good. So we are all for it. We are all for it. We are excited. So once again, very happy for you to join us. Why don't we start with a short introduction of you yourself, Zoe, and as well as your company, and then we will dive into the topic of the discussion.
Okay, great. So, yes, thanks so much. So again, for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Zoe, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about game theory and how you can use game theory to maximize your negotiation outcomes. So a bit about me, I work at a company called Nira Economic Consulting. We are part of Oliver Wyman and in a larger sense, part of Marsh McLennan. And within Nira, I work in the auctions and market design group. And our group is made up of economists, all with different backgrounds in game theory. And we work both in the public sector and the private sector, helping clients with the design and implementation of markets, such as auctions and negotiations or trading platforms. And within our practice, I specialize in helping procurement clients leverage game theory to design optimal negotiations to help them reach their procurement objectives. Before working as a consultant at Nira, I worked internally at Philips within their procurement organization, helping to build their negotiation center of excellence. Our group ran negotiations alongside the buyers, helping them integrate game theory into the negotiation design process, and at a larger level, helping drive the organizational change away from the traditional way of negotiating to this new way that leveraged game theory. So having been internal, I really understand what it's like to deal with all of the challenges that arise with stakeholders, with suppliers, with whomever it is when trying to do something in a new way. So a bit more about Nira. Don't need to spend too much time here. Everyone can look up Nira on the internet. But basically, we have a global practice. So you can see on the bottom right, this is not only where we have offices, but also where we have designed auctions and negotiations all over the world. We are the world's first economic consultancy, and you can read a little bit more about us online if you're interested.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Zoe. Your energy is evident in this space. That's a very celebrated career, especially with companies like Philips and all that. So diving into the discussion a little bit, Zoe, the what I read and in most of the media and when I talk to senior executives, I still hear that the headwinds of inflation, the headwinds of business uncertainty are is still very much there. There's high cost of financing. So how does that all make this topic so more relevant, especially for procurement executives in today's business environment, especially game theory and negotiations? Why is this so important for procurement and finance executives, uh, and even more important today?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that game theory and auctions, as we'll get into it, are one of the best tools available to companies when trying to mitigate pressure from headwinds or inflation. And I have seen it be incredibly effective over the last couple of years in these recent times. And I have some more to explain about why we really should care about game theory in procurement. So as my work internally within Philips and externally as a consultant, I have really observed a clear trend, which is that suppliers have gained the upper hand in the negotiation. Now, how this manifests is that companies are overpaying for their procurement spend because suppliers don't have the right incentives to lower their prices, right? And this could be for many reasons, right? We talked about the headwinds, inflation that could lead to price gouging, but the deeper problem is that there is this reluctance internally in organizations to switch suppliers for many different reasons. Risk aversion, there are stakeholder preferences or relationships, and people just prefer working with the supplier they know versus the supplier that they don't know. And what happens is that suppliers perceive this reluctance and they act accordingly. Incumbent suppliers get complacent and assume they're just going to win the business anyway, so they don't engage with their best prices. Maybe in an inflationary time, they will then take advantage of procurement and turn inflation into price gouging because they know they're so well embedded in the organization. Challenging suppliers who aren't in the organization yet think that, maybe we're just getting benchmarked. Maybe we don't have a real chance to win the business anyway. So they also don't engage with their best foot forward and compete aggressively to win the business. And so over time, procurement gets locked in with the same suppliers and becomes increasingly dependent on them without any leverage. So basically what you see is that the way that companies have been negotiating traditionally does not give them the right tools to fight what's going on in the market, whether it's inflation or the headwinds, as you mentioned, and doesn't give their suppliers the right incentives to get more aggressive and give them better offers and better pricing. So as a result, more procurement organizations are turning to game theory to help them regain the advantage and take back the upper hand in their negotiations. And we can get into how that works and why game theory is helpful, but just a couple examples first of how I'm seeing that happen. So I'm seeing companies work with building integrated, dedicated game theory centers of excellences, kind of like the one that I was part of, Philips. So a group that works alongside procurement in their negotiations to help get better procurement outcomes. I'm seeing companies work with external game theory consultants like myself who advise on negotiation strategy and execution, and others are investing in flexible e-sourcing platforms that have auction platforms as a part of them, which enables the use of game theory and competition in their negotiation design. So just a couple of examples of these companies on the right. We don't need to get too much into here, but these are all companies that I've come across with, either working with myself or as a consultant for, or, just coming across in the market, that have all done that first thing, which is building that game theory center of excellence. So you can see that it is not industry specific. It is really across the board that more and more companies are turning to game theory to help them in their negotiations.
That's outstanding and amazing. Like some of these, global brand names are investing heavily in implementing game theory, negotiation centers of excellence, and leveraging these, newer technologies to get that upper hand. And thank you. You really explained very well, how some of these suppliers, incumbent suppliers, can really take advantage, especially in the current environment of inflationary pressures, because I've come across situations where suppliers are asking for price increases, and buyers have no option because they are also fearful of whether they will get the supplies. So they are in a catch-22 situation. So outstanding. So diving a little bit more deeper into this, doing a double click on this, Zoe, tell us a little bit more about what exactly the concept of game theory is. How does it really work, and how can procurement professionals leverage it or mold it to their advantage in any situation of negotiation or sourcing?
Sure. Okay, well, we're going to get into the part that's a little bit like a high school class, so everyone be ready.
All for it. All for it. Open
Okay,
book.
good.
Yeah.
So, game theory is kind of a cool, sexy term that gets thrown around, but I don't think it oftentimes really gets explained thoroughly on what it is. So this is really where I want to start today. So game theory is the study of interactive decision making, where the outcome for each player in the interaction depends on the actions of all of the players. And that's really the key part. One player's outcome depends on what they do, but also what everybody else does. And so to explain that, I have some contrasting examples here. On the top ones where game theory is relevant, and on the bottom where they're not relevant. So think about rock, paper, scissors. Whether you win a game of rock, paper, scissors depends on what you throw out and what your opponent throws out. Whether you score a penalty kick depends on if you kick left, center, or right, and whether the keeper protects left, center, or right. Whether you win poker depends on your hand and how you bid and how you bluff, but also all of those things with your opponents as well. And not to get ahead of myself, but as a little preview, you can think about how suppliers bidding in a procurement tender, it depends who wins the tender on how they bid and how all the other suppliers bid as well. Now, conversely, for the examples on the bottom, game theory is not relevant. For these, you just care about you and your own choices and maybe some skill or luck or a clock running out. So you don't really have that element of interaction that you do in situations where game theory is relevant.
Okay. So the bottom one is like winning the lottery is kind of probabilistic and all that, but
exactly, winning the lottery,
science, yeah.
Playing slots, things like that. Totally.
Got it.
Okay, so in order to define a game that uses game theory, we're going to think about three things, and these three things are going to keep coming back, especially even when we talk about procurement especially. So we're going to think about who are the players. That's what is obvious. The next is, what are the strategies available to the players? Now, this is informed by the rules of the game. So in rock, paper, scissors, your strategy can be to throw rock 100% of the time, to alternate rock and paper, to randomize, so on and so forth. What are all the ways that the players can play the game? And finally, the payoffs. The payoffs are, what are all the possible combinations of strategies? What are all those payoffs that can result from those combinations of strategies? What can be won by the players? Now, games can have a lot of different outcomes, and the thing about game theory is you can predict the outcome of the game in games that use game theory, and you can do that by finding the equilibrium of the game. The most likely outcome will be the one that's in equilibrium. Now, equilibrium is this fancy word, but really what it just means is that no player in the game can do any better or improve their payoff by changing their game strategy. And you can find the equilibrium by analyzing the incentives of the player. So you can look at an outcome of a game and say, is this the most likely outcome? Is this an equilibrium? And the way you do that is to ask, does any player have an incentive to deviate from the strategy that got them in this outcome, right? So looking at a game, can anyone do better by changing their strategy? And that's how you find out whether a game is in equilibrium or not. So to illustrate this concept of equilibrium, I'm going to talk about probably the most famous example of game theory. If anyone ever took game theory class in college or high school, you've probably heard about this, but it's called the prisoner's dilemma, and it really illustrates this concept of what is the equilibrium and can anyone do better in a different outcome by switching their strategy. So the premise is this: there are two criminals and they rob a bank and they hide the money. However, after hiding the money, they get caught by a policeman who can't find the money, but is pretty sure that they robbed the bank and wants to get a confession out of them. So they get brought into the police station by the policeman, and they get put in two separate rooms, and they each get asked to deny or to confess the crime. And the only rule is that they have to decide simultaneously. There's no criminal A says deny and then he tells criminal B and then B gets to decide. No, they have to decide independently and simultaneously. So we can think about that framework, players, strategy, payoffs, when thinking about this game. The players are criminal 1 and 2. The strategies are they can deny or they can confess. And the payoffs are presented to them by the policeman as follows. If you both deny, you both get 1 year in jail. If you both confess, you both get 6 years in jail. But if one confesses and one denies, the confessor gets nothing and the denier gets 10 years in jail. So because we're talking about jail time here, payoffs, you want the smallest number possible because it's jail time. So the criminals are trying to get the smallest jail time possible. The policemen are trying to get is trying to get confessions. So you can illustrate these options that I just went through in this kind of 2x2 matrix here. So on the top, you have criminal 1 who can confess, deny. On the side, you have criminal 2 that can confess, deny. And you can see all the combinations of their strategy options here. So if they both deny, they both get 1 year in jail. So 1, 1. If they both confess, they both get 6 years in jail. And if one confesses and one denies, the confessor goes free and the denier gets 10 years in jail. So this is the setup with the different strategies and how they would translate into payoffs. So now that we have this here, we can think about, all right, what is the likely outcome of the game? What's the equilibrium here? So a lot of the times when I am doing this with participants or an audience, we'll have people kind of guess and think and raise their hand. And oftentimes the most likely suggestion that I get is that 1-1 is probably the equilibrium, right? It's the best option in terms of payoffs. It's sort of a win-win. They both get only 1 year. They avoid that 6. They avoid the 10. And it's a nice outcome for both of them. So if we start with, hypothesizing around this 1-1 outcome, we want to think about, is it an equilibrium? And to do that, like I said, you think about, could anyone do any better, and here that means get less jail time, by changing their strategy? And that means from going from deny to confess. And the answer is yes. One of them has an incentive to deviate. Well, they both have an incentive to deviate, because if they deviate, they can get 0 years in jail instead of 1 year in jail. So now we're thinking about this outcome. So the outcome of confess and deny. Does anyone here have an incentive to do anything different? And the answer is, again, yes. The other one has an incentive to deviate, and because they can get 6 instead of 10. So then we're in this possible outcome. Now, is this the outcome that's in equilibrium? Okay, well, they're both getting 6. That's not great. But could anyone do any better by deviating? And the answer is no, because if any of them switch from confess to deny, they're going to get 10 years instead of 6. So this is actually the equilibrium of the game, this 6-6. And this is why it's called a dilemma, because the prisoners want to end up in the 1-1 box, but the rules and the payoffs and you have to decide at the same time, all of that given to them by the policeman forces them to end in this 6-6 box. Now, I know this is a little bit of a tricky concept to understand, so I'm going to just explain the same thing one more way, and that is by looking at what is the best responses for the different criminals in this case. So let's assume criminal 1 confesses. Criminal 2 can confess or deny, and that means they can get 6 or 10. Okay, well, in this case, they would confess. 6 is the best response, or confess is the best response to confess. Now, let's assume criminal 1 denies. Criminal 2 can confess or deny, and that means get 0 or 1. And here, again, confess is the best response to this. And you can mirror this and look at this the other way and see that it's the exact same thing. And what this shows you is that no matter what your opponent does, no matter what the other criminal does, you are always better confessing. 6 is better than 10, 0 is better than 1, and that's how you end up in this 6-6, confess being the equilibrium of the game, even though it's something that the prisoners would not want. Now, the point that it is what the prisoners do not want is really important as we transition to thinking about what does all of this mean for procurement. Because we've been talking a lot about the prisoners in this game, and now I want to talk about the policemen as we transition over to procurement. Because it's critical to realize that the outcome of the prisoner's dilemma is not a coincidence at all. It is perfectly intentional and deliberate from the policeman. I went into this saying the policeman wanted a confession, and he got it by setting the specific rules and payoffs that would get it for them. If the policeman had picked different payoffs and different rules, the outcome would have been different. What if the prisoners were allowed to talk before their decision? This is a deliberate rule that the policeman said. He said, no talking, you're separate, and you have to decide on your own. What if the payoffs for confessing and denying were different? Like I said, he picked these payoffs very specifically. What if the prisoners made their decisions sequentially instead of simultaneously? So one of them confessed or denied, and then the policeman told the other criminal what happened, and then they got to decide to confess or deny. All of these things would have resulted in a different outcome. Now, what this is called is mechanism design, which is kind of just a fancy word for game design. And the idea is that if you are the game designer, which in this case is the policeman, you can design the game in a way to get you the outcome that you want. The policeman wanted a confession. He designed the game to get 2 confessions, even though the prisoners would have done better if they had done something else. So he picked the payoffs and the rules specifically to give him that result. And so the general idea is that setting the rules of the game gives the advantage to the rule-setting party. Here, the policeman set the rules, so he had the advantage. If the prisoners were able to set the rules, they would have the advantage. And so the good news is that in supplier negotiations, procurement is the policeman, and procurement is the one that is going to be able to set the rules of their own negotiations to drive the outcomes from their suppliers and the negotiation outcomes that they want. Okay. So to parallel this and to just show how it's very similar in procurement, I have sort of a silly but relevant example that I'm going to use to parallel over from this idea of the prisoner's dilemma. So we're now going to talk about the supplier's dilemma, which we're going to call the prisoner's dilemma in procurement. And here's the potential situation facing you as you're designing this negotiation. You're trying to award business, and you have 2 suppliers with equal cost structures that are interested in competing for your business. And the rule is that the lowest offer gets awarded the full business. And if both offer the same price, the business is split equally. And so the payoffs are as follows. The total profit at a high price is $6 million. So if you win the business alone at the high price, you get $6 million. If you win the business alone at the low price, you get $4 million. And again, the offers have to be made simultaneously. So you can think about it like this is a sealed bid, 1 round, best and final, winner takes all, where the suppliers are only allowed to put in high or low, and that's it. And the payoffs are as follows. The players are supplier A, B. The strategies is, like I said, they can do high-low, and the payoffs are if they both offer a high price, they split 3. If both offer a low price, they split 2. If one goes high and one goes low, the low price gets $4 million and the high price gets 0. So this is looking similar to the situation that we set up in the prisoner's dilemma. So I'm going to illustrate the same thing. If they both go high, they split $6 million. If they both go low, they split $4 million with 2-2. And if one goes high, one goes low, the low gets the full business at $4 million, and the high price gets nothing. So the same example or the same process of trying to find the equilibrium, you can think about, all right, what if they both go high, right? We think that they would like to end up winning the business at a high price. They would keep a lot of margin. They would keep the market at a high price. What would happen here? Well, one of them would have an incentive to deviate and go low to get $4 million and get the whole business. And then here you would have a situation where the other supplier is getting nothing. And they would also like to deviate and go low and get the business at a low price and get $2 million instead of 0. So low in this situation is the equilibrium. And this is again a dilemma because the suppliers would like to end up in a high price market, but the rules that you have set for them force them to both go in a low price and to hand over their margin. Now, I know this is a very simplified and slightly unrealistic example of a supplier negotiation, but I wanted to show it as a parallel to the prisoner's dilemma and to introduce the idea that as the game designer, procurement can design supplier negotiations in a way to optimize their outcomes.
I think I mean, even though it is explained very simplistically, I would say it very accurately represents and replicates a supplier's psychology towards, some of these negotiations as well as a buyer. Whether you're talking about a small deal or you're talking about multi-million dollars, several $100 million deals. I think the psychology really plays very much exactly this. So I think this is really a great foundation in terms of understanding that, whether you are in a buyer position or in a supplier position. How do you have to really, place your bets, and how do you really design the whole strategy towards negotiation? So when we have this, Zoe, how do you think that we can use this kind of a tool from a procurement standpoint to our advantage, our competitive advantage when we are negotiating with a supplier? How can this really be used in that sense? Any more examples or any more, thoughts? How to do
Yeah,
that?
definitely. So, like I said, this kind of example illustrated the concept, but obviously we all know in reality the negotiation in the game is way more complicated. There are a lot of things that we have to be thinking about, but the foundation of thinking about creating the game is still the same. And so the task facing procurement is to make all of the little decisions in building their game for that negotiation. What is the best game for the current negotiation that's going to give me the outcome I want? It involves making all of the little decisions around the players, the strategies, and the payoffs, because those are the decisions that will have a big impact on the outcome. So for example, the players. When you think about the players, you're thinking about who are the suppliers that are going to be involved in this negotiation. Which suppliers should we include or exclude? Now, maybe there's an incumbent supplier. Do we want to include them? Do we want to treat them differently? Are we going to invite challenger suppliers? How many challengers is the right number? If we move into doing a final auction, what's the right number of suppliers that's going to drive the best results in the final auction? So here's an example of all the little decisions around players. Then you have strategies. Now, like I said, strategies are what's available for the players to do given the rules. Now, that is oftentimes dictated by the negotiation format. So are we doing an auction? Are we going to do a bilateral negotiation? Are we going to have an auction where the suppliers log in and they bid against each other? Or are we going to have an auction where suppliers log in and we give them offers that they then accept or reject? If we have a tie break for some reason, what are the tie break rules? Are we going to have a best and final offer? Are we going to have a random number generator? How are we going to break the tie? Is it going to be based on a rank from, some other, maybe non-cost component? Here are some more decisions around strategies. The payoffs. So now, while you cannot directly affect the cost structure of your suppliers, you can affect what is available for them to win. So, for example, how long is the contract duration? That's going to drive what's the size of the business. Are we going to dual source or single source the business? If we dual source, how should we split the shares? So we split them very asymmetrically, so like an 80-20 or a 90-10, where one piece is really more attractive than the other. Or should we split them 50-50, where, both of them are equally appealing? And finally, information. So information is a little bit of a new one, but I wanted to bring it up because information and the game around how and when to release information is really important, because information is what can give suppliers the advantage back a little bit. Suppliers are always going to be trying to break out of this dilemma, and they're going to be trying to do so by getting more information from you about the negotiation. How many suppliers are there? Who am I competing against? Am I in first? Am I in last? How far am I from first? Things like that. All of these little pieces of information need to be specifically decided upon when and how and if at all to share them with suppliers. So you should be thinking about, what information do I want to share? Should I let them know about the level of competition, where they rank, things like that? All of these decisions around information need to be really, really deliberately made, because this is something that can really sway the advantage from one side to the other. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about auctions specifically, because auctions are one of the strongest and most effective tools available to buyers to shape competitive negotiations. Today's whole presentation started with an auction, the supplier's dilemma, and that might not have seemed like an auction, but it was an auction. Suppliers had one chance to submit a lower or high price. That was a single round auction. Now, auctions give you a lot of space to make creative rules to influence the outcome of the negotiation. And I don't think that auctions are always suitable to every negotiation, but when they are, they almost always drive better results than other methods. So why is that? First, auctions incentivize suppliers to submit more competitive offers, and this is for several reasons. First, auctions make competition visible to suppliers. Many times, suppliers don't really know if they're up against competition or how strong the competition is, and with the right auction format, they can see and feel that competition right there. Also, auctions can make suppliers feel more comfortable to bid aggressively for something that they see other suppliers also place a high value on it. And on top of that, there are all sorts of cognitive biases that get triggered in an auction that can incentivize more aggressive offers. And so for many reasons, that's why you see that auctions really outperform other negotiation methods in savings by, 10, 15, 20, 25%, I see sometimes when they're used correctly. And this is especially true with smaller procurement organizations where you can see a lot of the times that suppliers are baking in a lot of margin and taking advantage of procurement. The second reason I love auctions is that it encourages suppliers to participate meaningfully through being procedurally fair and being a very transparent process. I often get asked, how do suppliers react when you communicate them that you're running an auction? Are they upset? Do they not like that they're being pitted against each other? And that the truth is that many suppliers are fine with auctions and even prefer them due to how clear and transparent the rules are about how the supplier selection process is going to work. In traditional negotiations, like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes suppliers don't even know if they're really getting considered at all to win the business. Many are just being used for benchmarking, or they think that the decision is going to be made by the stakeholder with the highest influence. Therefore, they don't really participate in the negotiation in a meaningful way. And before you start an auction, every supplier knows that if they're in that auction, they have a real shot to win the business. They know exactly how the process is going to be run, and they know that stakeholders have signed off on honoring the outcome of the auction. And this induces meaningful and competitive competition. Now, transparency doesn't necessarily mean you give them all the information about all the bids and all the suppliers and everything. It means you're very transparent about the rules and the selection process and exactly how a winner is going to be picked. So finally, I love auctions because they remove stakeholder biases that are so present and influential in traditional negotiations. So many times, negotiating internally is the biggest roadblock to being able to negotiate effectively externally because stakeholders have such strong opinions on who should win the business. And a lot of the times, those opinions are valid and grounded in real value differentiators between suppliers. But many times they are a bit biased and grounded in a relationship they have with a supplier. And so when you force suppliers to quantify their preferences and you can use them as, bonuses or penalties in the auction or something, it forces them to put their money where their mouth is. And when you do that, you see a lot of the bias suddenly disappears.
And this is amazing because my own personal experience about auctions has also been very similar, Zoe. And you clearly are an expert in this field. You really know how to use the proven principles like negotiation, game theory, and incorporate that into an auction, leveraging really technology, transparency, and everything that you talked about. What do you think are some of the roadblocks? Why companies don't adopt auctions as frequent and as much as we would like them to be? Because it's a no-brainer to me. But
Yeah.
where do you see some of the companies? What are some of the biases or inhibitions that you come across when you talk to senior procurement leaders, that why don't they really want to use
Yeah.
auctions as often?
Yeah. So it's my opinion that to run an auction, you really only need to meet a couple of criteria. And the reasons that I often get for not running an auction are not really grounded in those criteria at all. So when thinking about running an auction, you really only need the following three things. The business needs to be commercially attractive to suppliers. Sometimes this process is a little bit more lengthy, and so for suppliers to engage in it and take on that extra work, it's good to have a business that's commercially attractive and not have it just be, the smallest spend that nobody really cares about. The second is, do you have more than one eligible supplier to win the business? That's it. You need two suppliers. I don't really support running an auction with one supplier only. And the third is, can we commit internally to award business to the auction winner? So will the stakeholders, buy into the process and say, we will honor the outcome of the auction? Now, that's oftentimes difficult to get because, like I said, stakeholders have preferences. They think that they, know what the best sourcing decision is, and they don't want to turn over that decision to a process where they can't have final say. But going through the TCO, total cost of ownership process with them and getting them to identify everything that they care about outside of price helps to make them feel like you're taking their considerations into account when designing the auction, and that the auction will take those into account in the offers. Now, one of the biggest roadblocks that I see come up is when companies talk about the fact that it's just not going to work in their category, right? Auctions can work with widgets or commodities or whatever, and my category is too complicated. And the reason that I wanted to talk about these three criteria on the left is to say that it is really the market and not the category that determines the applicability of running an auction. And there are no categories that are just out of scope as a starting point. And so to show that, I just want to illustrate examples of categories where I have run auctions before. And you'll see a lot of categories here that fall into indirect spend, that are not just about sourcing commodities or widgets, so to say, and highlighting a couple of these ones in yellow to show a couple where I hear, hey, we could never do an auction on consultants or for real estate or things like that. And the answer is yes, you can. Your auction format changes and how you construct the offers and think about the rules of the game, all that things I was talking about, players, strategies, payoffs. That is always, always, always revisited in an auction design, and there are so many variations in different types of auction designs and auction rules that you can pick from, and I can talk about those in a second. But this just to say that there's so many possibilities that it is possible to create an auction that will fit really any category if the market suits it.
I mean, clearly with this set of, wide landscape, Zoe, you have a wide and deep experience in running auctions and running these programs for these large corporations. What do you think, some of these companies, are they well equipped to run, there is an education component to, auctions, there is a project management component to it, there's a change management component to it. Do you think a lot of these companies are equipped to do something like that internally all on their own, or do you think that they would be better off with some sort of a support from an expert like you, to set it up, to run it? Or what do you think is the best value? Where do you think the companies can benefit the most out of thinking about an auction as a negotiation tool and setting it up as part of their procurement process in the long run?
So I think that the end goal is that a company is not dependent on me or some other consultant to do stuff like this. The end goal is that this becomes best practice and internalized in the company, and buyers in almost all categories in the company are well versed in how to run auctions in their negotiations. Or you have a situation like I talked about in the beginning where you have center of excellences, then that is their primary responsibility, and they support their buyers in how to structure a negotiation in a competitive way to run an auction. That's the end goal. So I don't think that having a perpetual situation where you outsource all of this is ideal. You want to get the knowledge in-house. Now, to get the knowledge in-house, I think that a lot of the times some assistance externally is helpful. Because this involves doing something in a new way, and convincing people to do something in a new way is always a hurdle. So a lot of the times I will run trainings with companies where we go through sort of what is the theory behind game theory, talk about different auctions and auction types and things like that, and then how do you really apply that in practice when selecting how to pick the right auction format and game format for your given negotiation. I think one really nice outcome of that training is that it gets people really excited about this concept, and it gets them to start to think, hey, I've got this upcoming negotiation where, it's a good size spend and we have, multiple suppliers we could award to. I think this would be something where it would be helpful to run a process like that. And then that normally informs the next step, which is where we can actually work alongside the buyers who have identified that opportunity in, working with them to help them execute the negotiation with running an auction. Now, the technology component is also a completely different part of it. I cannot tell you the number of companies I come across that say, yeah, actually, we have access to an auction tool, we've never used it, or we have access to an auction tool through a subscription to like a larger, platform, and we don't know how to use it, or things like that, right? So many times they have this technology at their fingertips, and figuring out how to best take use of it is also a big impact for them, and gets them more comfortable in figuring out how to use it and how to leverage it to drive these outcomes. That's not to say that technology is a roadblock. In the times of COVID, I would run hundreds of millions of dollar auctions over email. You don't need a tool. Tools make things fancier and maybe nicer, but you don't need a tool per se. But there's so many companies that have tools that aren't using them, don't know how to use them, and that's also oftentimes a really good place to start.
Sounds good. Very good. Thank you very much. That's very thoughtful.
Yeah, for sure. So I had talked about how you can craft these auctions in so many different ways to fit the type of category or supplier landscape that you're trying to negotiate with. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples to sort of open up your brains a little bit to the world of what's possible. So when you think about designing an auction, the game design really begins. It's kind of designing a game within a game, because, like I said, there are so many choices you can make and so many variations of auction formats and rules, each which are stronger and more effective in different scenarios. And again, if you make all of these choices in the right way, you can get the most value out of your negotiation. So the first thing you want to think about is, what is the auction format? Are you going to do an auction with increasing prices where the price starts really, really, really low and increases, or decreasing where the price starts high and then drops until all the suppliers except one have dropped out? Is it going to be a single round? Is it going to be a multi-round? Each one has its strengths and weaknesses for different categories, different supplier landscapes. The next question is, what level of visibility are you going to give suppliers about their bids? Are you going to give them no information, or are you going to give them a traffic light indicator, or maybe a ranking? Are they going to get to even see all the bids? Again, each one of these works better in different ways. Next, you want to think about, how are you going to bundle the spend in an auction? Are you going to award it all at once? Are you going to break it into packages and award it sequentially? If so, what should the sequence of those packages be? And finally, the pricing rules. What should the starting price be? And how about the increments? Is there a threshold above which you won't even award the business at all? And across all of these different components, you also always want to be thinking about, how are we going to integrate the things outside of cost into an auction? And that is really a point that I want to make sure I reiterate here, is that auctions are not only about looking at price and driving price down. You always want to be running an auction on total cost of ownership, which means your auction accounts for all of the different things besides price that go into your sourcing decisions. So a lot of times you can do that by calculating those differences upfront and incorporating them into your auction. Some auction platforms have the ability for suppliers to compete on non-cost components during the auction, so they can, let's say, change their payment terms or whatever, and then they will see that their total offer changes, right? So again, we're talking about all of these different things, but I really want to break the idea that auctions are only about price, because that's really where you get stuck in a lot of this thinking that auctions aren't going to work in my category because I care about more than price. Well, auctions also care about more than price and are also used to get you things other than price. So I just want to make sure that I reiterate that point. So again, I know it's a lot of decisions, but the takeaway here is that all of these decisions are giving you the power to design whatever game you want, whatever game you think will be most effective in driving the outcomes in the situation that you're in. And I hope that people who listen to this take away from, you have a lot of tools at your disposal to actually design the negotiations, to your advantage and drive savings and other commercial outcomes that you care about.
Sounds good. Well, Zoe, this has been an excellent session. Clearly, like you said, your knowledge, your experience, and your energy, in this practice is evident. I hope to, have many more follow-up discussions. And for our audience, you should give Zoe a follow on LinkedIn. She's a very well celebrated speaker, thought leader in this space. So go ahead and follow her on LinkedIn. Shoot your questions directly to her, and we look forward to bringing more thought leaders like this via Procurement League. So thank you again for joining us, Zoe, today. It was a
Great.
pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Take care. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.